Exactly. Mental health is something so stigmatized inside and outside our community. And on top of that, like you said before, it's not something that necessarily shows or that you can prove. I have seen for myself there, I guess there is a way it can show on the outside in terms of behavior. Say, for example, someone has a particular reaction to something. That reaction in itself is very telling. And the questions
Mm-hmm.
that I've learned from myself to decipher like what's going on would be, okay, well, what am I really reacting to? Is this a surface level thing? Is this something deeper? What did it make me feel? Why did it make me feel that way? What you said, core beliefs do I have about it? Where did I get
Mm-hmm.
those from? And how can I resolve this? But the thing is, you wouldn't recognize that unless you knew what to look for and what questions to ask. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think when you were saying that, I had this image of how the human brain works, right? So the brain develops from the bottom part, right? So the primitive part of the brain, which is our brain stem, is where the brain develops up from. So we've got the brain stem, we've got the emotional brain, and then we have the learning brain. And when a stimulus is presented, uh, to be able to access the learning part of the brain, it works its way up, bottom up. So when you find first is the primitive brain, which is the fight and flight mode of the brain that fires up. So to be able to get to the upper story, we have to work the bottom up. And if the primitive part of the brain is, which we also call the reptilian brain, if the primitive part of the brain is perceiving that particular event as threatening, it acts up, right? Even though this may not be a threatening event. So moving into that flight and fight mode doesn't allow, so one may have a reaction to something which can be a trauma response, right? So for example, if I grew up and when I was a child, my aunt told me, go to sleep, otherwise the dog will come and bite you. The primitive brain gets conditioned to the dog equals bite. And even though I may have not have had any experiences growing up where the dog had bitten me, when I am an adult and a dog walks down, my primitive brain, because that's what takes up the information up, fires up and saying, stay away, this is danger. I may not remember that my aunt, when I was 5 years old, said that to me, but the brain keeps a memory and gets activated, right? So when we tap into going into the basement, taking those beliefs out, recognizing what the origin of those are, we can train our learning brain to learn and look out for false alarms.
So in terms of like the unconscious mind, you said, so it's, I think what I've heard is from the ages of 0 to like approximately 8 is where you have all this information that becomes the unconscious mind. So people even in the age of 20, 30, 40, 90 are still running on that same programming they had at the age of 5. Is that correct?
Right. So I think what we know is that, and again, I'm not an expert in this, but what we know is that as the unconscious brain is developing, and the children often don't remember their experiences at least till the age of 3 or 4, and some of us don't remember. I don't have a very good memory of remembering any of that before I was maybe 8 or 10 myself. But what we do know and what we are finding more is that the body and the mind keeps score. It may not be a part of your conscious awareness. However, one can have a visceral reaction, or the body can respond if a triggering experience in childhood gets stimulated in adult years.
I've also heard, so the reason people, I guess children would forget their trauma is that the brain isn't matured enough to process it, so it stores it in the subconscious, and then that's why
Mhm,
you get 20-year-olds who then are depressed and they don't know why, and
mhm.
so it'll come back in when the brain is mature enough to be able to process that, but you may not know like consciously, okay, but what happened to me, like why do I feel this way?
Right, right, yeah. And so trauma is not often remembered as a memory, especially if it's been in the early years where a child doesn't remember if it was a trauma in childhood. Trauma is often remembered in symptoms, right? So symptoms can show up as anxiety, depression, isolation, self-harm, shaming of self, right? Trauma also influences developing negative core beliefs about self. So you're right that and when a traumatic event happens in the life of a person, In the moment, the brain only has a certain amount of capacity to absorb the experience. So it absorbs a small part of that experience, and rest of the experience gets deeply embedded in the memory deep inside that may not be accessible then. And that's why sometimes later in years, an adult might recall traumatic experiences and would think, oh my God, how come I'm thinking about this now? Because there is a certain way that brain tends to save the memory that has been traumatic to protect self, and so that the self can continue to be present in everyday living and the trauma doesn't hold the person back.
So my question pertaining to all that is, what would you say are some behavioral signs, inner or outer, of someone who's been mentally or emotionally abused?
So I think that, like I was saying earlier, that mental or emotional abuse or traumatic experiences as defined by them can lead to developing certain ways of coping that the individual gets into to help cope through that. So some of the behavioral signs can be self-sabotaging behaviors that individual may get to. So, self-harm is one of them. Substance use, alcohol, drug use can be ways that individuals cope. High level of avoidance, oversleeping, undersleeping can also be a traumatic response, anxiety, depression, or inability to focus, irritability, or difficulty with relationships can also be a result of emotional and psychological traumatic experiences. We know that children who have had early experiences of childhood invalidation, or on that continuum of emotional and psychological trauma often can have disorganized attachments, where there is this kerfuffle within, or that you're not sure if you should run towards that visual of a caring, secure, safe figure, or run away from. So flight and fight mode can develop often if one goes through that. There's a really good study called the ACE study, which talks about adverse childhood experiences that can be traumatic, and can help draw some insight into how children cope with childhood experiences, and what could be some of the behavioral manifestations of that.
I wanted to ask you that because I feel things like that are really easily overlooked. And I hear a lot of, oh, that wasn't abuse. It happens to a lot of kids in this community or that community or this part of the world.
Right.
And I don't understand that, because for me, when I look at it logically, unhealthy behaviors or beliefs being common in a society doesn't make them healthy. Say we all faced a common dysfunction, it doesn't magically mean it's now functional. So for you, having you as a psychotherapist validating what emotional abuse even means, despite that very strange popular opinion, I think helps break down that ideology. And so for anyone listening who is ever confused about whether or not what you experienced was emotionally or mentally healthy, or on the other end, abusive, I would just ask a professional and seek help if needed.
Another episode of the Speak Real podcast, sharing one-on-one conversations. We believe that storytelling is the best way to empower youth and give them the platform to find their voices.
Presented by Youth Speak. Youth experience, youth voice, youth empowered.